PCC TV.
Today's episode is on the history of Mexican food in the United States. Americans now buy more salsa than ketchup. And when I say Mexican food, I suppose it really should be called Mexican-American cuisines. It's really a fusion, but more on that later. We're going to use the historic Palos Verdes eatery, the Red Onion restaurant, as our proxy for the discussion of the recent evolution of Mexican cuisine in the U.S. since both it and Palos Verdes have grown up and changed substantially in the last half-century. Since much of the western U.S. was, at one time, Mexican territory, it's no surprise that Mexican food has been here a long time. So I'm not going to trace its origins back to prehistory or the Spanish era, but rest assured, like all good food, it's evolved over time and with different influences. Instead, we'll look at the early American exposure to this type of cuisine and then the impact on the larger American culture. Now, initially it was only those adventurers, cowboys, or soldiers who were exposed to the culture and flavors as they ventured into Mexican territory. These cowboys and adventurers and soldiers made the cuisine popular, albeit regional. It didn't really see massive expansion until later. Fast forward to post-World War II, and the acceptance of different kind of foods and cultures really kicked up a lot. That's when a large number of American soldiers were coming back from overseas and brought some more adventurous culinary tastes. Witness the rise of tiki bars, which were Polynesian-ish, which were really taking inspiration from all of Micronesia to create something new. Also fueling the integration of Mexican cuisine into the mainstream culture was the rise in the number of Mexican Americans. In 2022, Mexican Americans comprised 11% of the U.S. population and almost 60% of all Hispanic and Latino Americans. So, increasing openness to new foods, increasing numbers and integrations of Mexican nationals and Mexican Americans really opened up the American popular palate to this style of cuisine. A recent study by the Pew Research Group claims that 1 in 10 restaurants currently in the U.S. is a Mexican restaurant. Although especially common in California and Texas, Mexican restaurants are found in the large majority of all the counties in the U.S. Now, as mentioned earlier, they're very common in California and Texas. These two states, which are home to a majority of the Mexican American population, have around 40% of all Mexican restaurants in the country, 22% being in California, and LA County alone is home to 30% of the state's Mexican restaurants. So let's examine the Red Onion and the rise and evolution of these Mexican-American restaurants post-World War II. As I implied earlier, like Chinese food before it, the style of Mexican cuisine in America changed to incorporate flavors that appealed to non-Hispanics and created some new dishes that were not found in Mexico. As a result, what we see is that many of the popular Mexican restaurants today serve dishes that are inspired by Mexico, if you will. Now let's look at the Red Onion. The first Red Onion opened in Inglewood in 1949 as a small 15-seat diner called the Red Onion Cafe in Inglewood. Now before World War II, Inglewood was primarily agrarian, believe it or not. But the war brought prosperity to the aviation industry, and especially to the recent arrival of Inglewood of North American aviation. High-paying jobs at the plant and suppliers followed and provided the potential customer base businesses needed. Now, the Earl family, who started the Red Onion, used their grandmother's Sonoran-based recipes as a foundation to create a cuisine that became a mainstay in Southern California life.
And now for something completely different.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, is it totally authentic Mexican food? It's really more of a fusion style. So I would argue this type of cuisine should be called Cali-Mex, as it differs from the Tex-Mex style. And red onion perfectly represents the Cali mix style of food that's so popular here. In 1963, the Palos Verdes Red Onion opened. It opened in Palos Verdes, where there were very few restaurants at the time, and it began the tradition of the red onion on the peninsula, which obviously lasts to this day. It was designed in the Spanish hacienda style, with a red tile roof and reclaimed bricks, colorful floor tiling and red leather booths, sombreros and serapes on the wall. And what's fascinating to see is how this time period, the early 1960s, spawned variations in the Mexican food formula. Because, ironically, also starting in the early 60s, around the same time, would be one of the largest Mexican food-inspired restaurants in the world, Taco Bell. Now, as a quick service restaurant or a fast food restaurant, Taco Bell led the way to expose Mexican food, or maybe Mexican-ish like food, to the larger American audience. It may be the least authentic variant on the planet, but it was inspired by a real restaurant, which was just across the street from owner Glenn Bell's initial restaurant in Riverside. Now, he opened his eatery in 1962 with 5 items on the menu. And as of 2022, there are over 8,000 Taco Bell restaurants in 32 different countries. Now, it's really fascinating to think back on a time when Mexican food wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now. Take this 1960s Taco Bell menu. They had to provide pronunciation aids for the food. Now, there isn't a corner of America that doesn't know what a burrito is or how to say it. Popping back to Palos Verdes, so through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, acceptance of and business for Mexican food grew. For instance, the Red Onion family of restaurants increased. At one time, there were 26 Red Onion locations. The family sold the chain to Host International in 1973, keeping only the Palos Verdes location. And this location has stayed in the family ever since. And best of all, they embrace and celebrate their history. Not gonna lie, the Red Onion doesn't disappoint. Truly, this is the comfort food that we, or at least I, grew up on. I love this place. It's like stepping into a time machine and racing back to the 60s when the doors first opened. From when you first enter, it's truly an immersive experience. Imagine if Walt Disney opened a theme restaurant. This would be it. The decor varies room by room. One with birds, it sort of feels like a tiki bar now that you mention it. One room is decorated with drawings and menus from the old Brown Derby. One with sports paraphernalia, and by the way, I hope you like USC. Others with images of the Mexican Revolution or Mexico, old Mexico. So amazing. The Red Onion is a snapshot in time.
And we're back!
Now, the evolution of Mexican food continues. We now have celebrity chefs, as well as rolling food trucks, crisscrossing the nation and expanding on the repertoire. Now, recently there's been a trend to embrace authentic Mexican food, as well as various forms of regional Mexican food, and I am all for that. It's a great time to be eating. But I'm also all for keeping the Red Onion the same as it is now. What I love best is that the Red Onion takes me back to a simpler time in America. Back to when the culture was expanding, it was exciting, its acceptance of new cuisines was there, and you could taste it in the amazing food that the Red Onion serves. If you're in PV, you simply must go to experience the retro charm of the area and the Red Onion. If you've been watching this far, I thank you.
Bye.
Transfer complete.